say that he's arbitrarily and capricious and he can just do anything he wants because he can only do those things which are in conformity to his nature, which is good, such as he cannot lie, etc., laws of non-contradiction. But we'll get into that later. When God originally made the world, now this is based on Christian doctrine, he made it good without defect. Now in terms of, in the free will basis, where did sin come from then? Well, it came from the creature. This is not something God caused to happen in some manner. This was not something that I believe he desired to have happen, but he permitted it. It was a potential within the design. So then what are we learning? Well, think about the farm. Okay, there's suffering going on that we are not aware of, but yet we are psychologically aware of it in the sense that we can think on these things. And so again, we look at those things. Those things are terrible. Those things should not be, and you're right, they should not be. And they will not be, but not today.
Okay, well,
Is there a brief response you guys would like to
brief
make?
response, what's he waiting for? I mean, what?
Shannon just answered that.
Okay, I know we're probably out of time. Just remark the, God is all powerful. He can make us come to Him, and you didn't give us anything that needs suffering to happen. Coming to know God, He could do that just by appearing to the world, aligning the stars in the sky to say, I'm here, I exist, humanity, worship me, love me, I'm here. He doesn't have to make people suffer and the Holocaust to happen. He doesn't have to allow it to happen, which, by the way, he knew was going to happen before Hitler was born, just pointing out. He doesn't have to allow it to happen for us to realize, oh, suffering is bad. We need to have God to relinquish, this suffering in the afterlife. It just doesn't make sense.
Yeah, I think we're going to get to the hiddenness of God issue momentarily, but just quickly, that is a burden you have to shoulder. You have to establish that God would or could accomplish the same ends with different means, and I don't know how you prove that.
He's all powerful. How could he not? You
And
have
that is a misconception.
his omnipotence. Is a
The way you're understanding it is a misconception.
How am I misunderstanding omnipotence?
Okay, I'm gonna cut you guys off right there. Not that level of conversation or challenge is inappropriate. In fact, it's welcome. But I think we'll get a chance to address those types of misconceptions in future questions. So the second question, would you guys like to ask?
All right, we'll just take it from the top here then. As physicists have learned more and more, we've begun to understand how fundamentally different the world would be with only very tiny adjustments in the physical universe. For example, if the force of gravity compared to the electromagnetic force were a little stronger, even 1/100th of 1%, complex molecules could never form, and thus life could not exist. Similarly, if the expansion rate of the universe were stronger by just a tiny amount, galaxies and stars would have been prevented from forming, and again, life would not exist. Many more such examples exist, and given all of this, isn't it highly less likely that the physical universe just coincidentally and accidentally lined up in every way to make life possible? Isn't it much more reasonable to conclude that God has fine-tuned these initial conditions with us in mind?
Okay, let me just begin by saying, of all the arguments out there for theism, I think this is the coolest one. I think this is the most compelling and the most interesting. It takes the form of what we were talking about earlier, an inference to the best explanation argument, and the suggestion is that we've discovered something that's embarrassing to the atheist. We've discovered something that's embarrassing to naturalism, that these parameters of the universe are so perfectly tuned in this way to allow for intelligent life to come about. That just didn't happen by chance. I think that's a really interesting and compelling argument. There's been a lot of discussion of the intelligent design movement, and the intelligent design movement has these two strands to it. All the attention's been focused on the anti-evolutionary strand, where it's claimed that they're finding aspects of biology that evolution can't explain, and it's evidence of intelligent design. None of that stuff strikes me as very interesting or compelling. It's all been kind of blown out of the water. This, however, this kind of version of the intelligent design argument, I think, is really quite interesting, and I think atheists need to deal with it, and they need to bring their A game if they're going to. Now, I don't think the argument ultimately works. There's a couple of responses that are out there. And one response is to basically say, yes, there is something that needs to be explained. The fine-tuning we discovered does need to be explained, but there's a naturalistic explanation for it. The other response is basically, no, it's not something that needs to be explained. It's not something surprising. It's not an embarrassment for naturalists. So let me just briefly touch on both of those responses. At one time, a version of this argument was offered not with regard to the universe and the basic parameters of the universe, but the solar system. Because it turns out that Earth and its position from the sun appears to be uniquely fine-tuned for life to come about on Earth. It's exactly the right distance from the sun. The size of Jupiter prevents various asteroids from crashing into Earth so the atmosphere could form. In various ways, our solar system is uniquely fine-tuned for life. And a lot of people said, that's evidence of God. Now, the way an atheist responded to that, however, is to point out that there are billions of solar systems out there in the world. There are tons and tons of solar systems. And if the chances of one of them being fine-tuned in the way that ours is fine-tuned is 1 in a billion, and you've got a million billion solar systems, then in fact we have an explanation for how one of them came about. And of course we would find ourselves in one of those few solar systems that is actually fine-tuned in that way. So we have a naturalistic explanation for that. Now, the suggestion that's offered by some naturalists is you can make the same kind of response with regard to universes. There are a variety of different sort of physical hypotheses that are out there. Different sorts of versions of physics suggest something like a multiverse hypothesis, where there are actually an unlimited number of universes that are out there, and so if you have an infinite number of universes or a huge number of universes, you would expect at least some of them to be uniquely fine-tuned for intelligent life to come about. So it's a similar kind of response. Now, there is a bit of a worry with regard to that response, and I don't want to, we can get into it in the question and answer period, but the worry is that it's a fallacy to go from the low probability of a particular event, like a particular universe, to the conclusion that it must be a member of a much larger set. It's called the reverse gambler's fallacy. I'll explain it later if you want to get into it. However, if you have independent reason for believing that there's a large number of universes, as many physicists claim to have, then you can appeal to that fact to try to explain how a particular universe came, or how there happens to be a fine-tuned universe. Now that's one response. The other response is to suggest that the discovery of fine-tuning, in fact, is not an embarrassment for the atheist. It's not an embarrassment for naturalists. And in fact, it's exactly what you'd expect to find if naturalism is indeed true. And so here's a little experiment, here's a little thought experiment. Ask yourself this question. Without knowing anything about the basic parameters of the universe, what do you think the likelihood would be if we go and investigate those parameters? What do you think the likelihood is that with regard to every single last one of them, they can all admit a wide variance and the universe would still pretty much turn out the way that it did? In other words, the basic forces of nature, the gravitational constant, all of those could have been really radically different and things would have turned out the way they did. I think you'd say not very likely at all. In other words, I think just our basic common sense understanding of physics, our basic common sense understanding of the world would suggest that a certain degree of fine-tuning is always to be expected. So my hunch is that when you think about it, it's not at all surprising that some of these parameters had to be just a certain specific sort of way for the world to turn out, for the universe to turn out the way it did. In fact, it's actually very rare. There are practically no complicated events or complicated states of affairs which are such that all the background conditions could be radically different and those complicated state of affairs would turn out the